Of the Appalachians' children, born to sin, who inherited their family's forbidden past. In the deep heart of Appalachia, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels and the morning mist clings to valleys untouched by time, a darkness so profound existed that even the trees seemed to bend away from it. The story of the Holloway family is this: a clan whose roots ran as deep and twisted as the gnarled oaks surrounding their isolated homestead in Harlan County, Kentucky. It was the spring of 1967, when Margaret Hayes, a young physician fresh from her residency in Louisville, first encountered the Holloways. Driven by an idealistic desire to serve those forgotten by modern medicine, she had accepted a position at the rural clinic in Cumberland. Her medical training held nothing that could have prepared her for what she would discover in those remote hills. The day was unseasonably warm for April when at the clinic's weathered door, Sarah Holloway appeared. The woman, who appeared to be in her 60s but was actually 42, carried a child wrapped in a tattered quilt. In her private journal, Dr. Hayes would later write that the moment she unwrapped that blanket, she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The infant, a girl of approximately 6 months, exhibited physical characteristics that defied Dr. Hayes's understanding of normal human development. Severe malformations her skull displayed. Her eyes were set unusually close together, and her limbs bore the unmistakable signs of multiple genetic abnormalities. But it was the pattern of features, the repetition of specific traits, that sent a chill down the doctor's spine. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. My granddaughter, Lily Mae, this is, Sarah said, her voice carrying the thick accent of deep Appalachia. We don't come down from the mountain often, but she's been crying something fierce. With trembling hands, Dr. Hayes conducted her examination. The child's condition was severe. A clefted palate, webbed fingers, and what appeared to be significant developmental delays. But these were not random mutations. These were the hallmarks of something far more sinister, something Dr. Hayes had only read about in textbooks. Mrs. Holloway, the doctor began carefully, I need to ask you some questions about your family. How many generations have lived on that mountain? Distant grew Sarah's weathered face. My great-great-grandfather, Josiah Holloway, he settled up there in 1847. None of us have ever left. We don't need to. Everything we need, we got up there. Over the following weeks, obsessed with understanding the Holloway family, Dr. Hayes became. Through careful questioning and examination of birth records at the county courthouse, she began to piece together a horrifying genealogy. The Holloway family tree didn't branch. Inward it spiraled like a tightening noose. Josiah Holloway had arrived in Harlan County with his wife Ruth and their 3 children. But Ruth had died within the first year, and according to fragmentary records, Josiah had remarried a woman listed only as J. Holloway. When she realized the truth, Dr. Hayes's blood ran cold. His own daughter Josiah had taken as his wife. From that union came 6 children, and from those children came more. Each generation marrying within the family, father to daughter, brother to sister, uncle to niece. For 120 years, the Holloway bloodline had remained absolutely closed, a genetic spiral descending into darkness. Staggering were the medical implications. Dr. Hayes discovered that nearly every child born to the Holloways in the past 3 generations exhibited some form of genetic disorder. Some were minor, a slight deformity here, a learning difficulty there, but others were catastrophic. Of children who had died in infancy, their bodies too malformed to sustain life, she learned. Whispered stories she heard of teenagers locked in back rooms, their minds never developing beyond that of toddlers. And with her own eyes, she saw adults in their 30s who looked 70, their bodies aged prematurely by the accumulation of genetic damage. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. In May of 1967, the decision to visit the Holloway homestead herself was made by Dr. Hayes. Up a barely passable dirt road that wound higher and higher into the mountains, she drove her rusted Ford truck. The trees grew denser, the sunlight dimmer, until she emerged into a clearing that seemed frozen in another century. The Holloway compound consisted of 3 ramshackle cabins arranged in a rough triangle, their wooden walls gray with age and neglect. Like the bones of ancient beasts, rusted farm equipment lay scattered. But it was the people who emerged from those cabins that truly disturbed her. There were perhaps 20 of them, ranging from infants to elderly, and nearly all bore the unmistakable signs of severe genetic disorders. Toward her shambled a teenage boy with a grotesquely enlarged head, making unintelligible sounds. Two girls, who might have been sisters or cousins, or both, shared identical facial deformities that made their features almost unrecognizable as human. An old man, bent and twisted, watched from a doorway with eyes that held a terrible awareness. "You're the doctor woman," he said, his voice surprisingly clear. "Ezekiel Holloway, I suppose you've come to judge us." Carefully, Dr. Hayes approached him. "I've come to help if I can. Mr. Holloway, do you understand what's happening to your family?" Bitter was Ezekiel's laugh. "I understand plenty, doctor. I'm 68 years old and I've watched 3 generations born and die on this mountain. I've seen babies who couldn't breathe, children who couldn't walk, adults who couldn't think. I know what we are." "Then why?" Dr. Hayes asked, her voice breaking. "Why do you continue?" Hard grew the old man's eyes. "Because this is what we know. My father told me his father told him that Josiah said we had to keep the bloodline pure, keep the land in the family, keep ourselves separate from the corruption down below. And so we have. For 5 generations, we've married our own. And God help us, we'll probably continue until there's none of us left." Over the next hour, the full history of the Holloway family was told to Dr. Hayes by Ezekiel. Josiah had been fleeing something, a crime or a scandal no one remembered anymore. He'd brought his family to the most isolated spot he could find and declared that they would never mix with outsiders. Never let their bloodline be diluted. And his children, raised in complete isolation, had known nothing else. Because some family secrets are too dark to remain buried, the story continues, and understanding the devastating truth of genetic isolation could change how you see the hidden corners of our world. By the time the practice became clearly destructive, it was too late. The family was trapped in a cycle of their own making. Each generation born with fewer choices than the last. Like interest on an unpayable debt, the genetic damage accumulated, and the isolation that had started as a choice had become a prison. As many family members as would allow her to approach them, Dr. Hayes examined. In meticulous detail, she documented her findings. The high rates of infant mortality, the prevalence of physical deformities, the cognitive impairments, the shortened lifespans. The biological cost of one man's obsession, paid by 5 generations of innocent children, she was witnessing. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of blood and shadow, Dr. Hayes prepared to leave. But Ezekiel stopped her with a gnarled hand on her arm. "There's something you should know, doctor," he said quietly. "There are 4 more families like ours in these mountains. The Carters over in Bell County, the Meadows in Leslie County, the Brocks in Clay County, and the Turners in Bright County. All of them doing the same thing we've done. All of them suffering the same way." Felt her knees weaken, Dr. Hayes did. "For more families? How many people are we talking about?" "Maybe 100 souls, all told," Ezekiel replied. "All of them trapped in the same hell we made for ourselves." That night, Dr. Margaret Hayes returned to Cumberland with a burden that threatened to crush her spirit. In her small apartment above the clinic, surrounded by medical journals and genetics textbooks, she sat, trying to understand the full scope of what she had witnessed. In 1967, the science of genetics was still in its relative infancy. James Watson and Francis Crick had discovered the structure of DNA only 14 years earlier in 1953. But even with limited scientific understanding, the consequences of sustained consanguinity were well documented in medical literature. A worn copy of Human Heredity by Ashley Montague, Dr. Hayes pulled out and began taking notes. A damning story the mathematics of genetic inheritance told. When closely related individuals procreate, the probability of offspring inheriting identical copies of harmful recessive genes increases dramatically. While everyone carries some defective genes, they usually remain hidden, masked by healthy copies from the other parent. But when both parents share significant portions of their genetic code, as siblings or parent-child pairs do, those hidden defects emerge like shadows at noon. An extreme case the Holloway family represented, but the pattern was predictable. Josiah's union with his daughter meant their children inherited severely limited genetic diversity. When those children married each other, the genetic pool shrank further. With each successive generation, the accumulation of harmful mutations accelerated. On her wall, Dr. Hayes created a chart, mapping out what she knew of the Holloway genealogy. From Josiah and his daughter came 6 children. 4 survived to adulthood. Those 4 produced 15 children among them. Of those 15, only 9 lived past age 10. Those 9 produced 23 children, but 12 died in infancy or early childhood. And so it continued, each generation losing more children, each survivor bearing greater evidence of genetic catastrophe. The specific disorders she had observed matched the scientific literature perfectly. Cleft palates and other facial malformations common in highly consanguineous populations. Intellectual disabilities ranging from mild learning difficulties to profound cognitive impairment. Skeletal abnormalities, shortened limbs, spinal curvatures, malformed joints, heart defects, respiratory problems, immune system deficiencies. The list seemed endless. But Dr. Hayes knew the physical manifestations told only part of the story. The psychological impact of living in such isolation, of watching siblings and children die, of existing in a community where everyone shared the same damaged heritage, created trauma that science was only beginning to understand. She decided she needed to see the other families Ezekiel had mentioned. Over the following month, Dr. Hayes made it her mission to locate and document each isolated clan. The Carter family in Bell County was her first stop, and the Carters lived in a hollow so remote that even locals in the nearest town claimed not to know of their existence. Dr. Hayes had to abandon her truck and hike 3 miles through dense forest to reach their settlement. What she found made the Holloway compound seem almost prosperous by comparison. 9 people lived in 2 collapsing structures that barely qualified as shelters. The eldest, a woman named Rebecca Carter, who claimed to be 55 but looked ancient, greeted Dr. Hayes with suspicion that bordered on hostility. "We don't need outsiders here," Rebecca said, her words slurred by a severe speech impediment caused by her misshapen jaw. "We take care of our own." But when Dr. Hayes explained that she was a doctor who only wanted to help, Rebecca's resistance crumbled. "Help," she said bitterly. "Can you help my grandson who can't see? Can you help my daughter who can't walk? Can you help my great-niece who's been having fits since birth?" The Carter family story mirrored the Holloways in its essential details, though their isolation had begun slightly later. In 1869, the founder, Silas Carter, had brought his family into the mountains after deserting from the Confederate Army during the final months of the Civil War. Fearing prosecution, he had hidden his family away and established the same destructive pattern. Isolation, intermarriage, and the slow genetic collapse that followed. To a back room, Rebecca led Dr. Hayes where her grandson, a boy of perhaps 12, sat rocking in the corner. His eyes, clouded with cataracts, saw nothing. His hands, twisted by arthritis that should not afflict someone his age, clutched a worn blanket. Soft whimpering sounds he made, the only communication he seemed capable of. "This is Daniel," Rebecca said softly. "My daughter's boy. His father is my son. I know it's wrong, doctor. I know it in my bones. But what choice did we have? There's no one else up here but family." 3 days Dr. Hayes spent with the Carter family, documenting their medical conditions and taking detailed family histories. The pattern was unmistakable and heartbreaking. Silas Carter had married his own sister after his first wife died. Their children had married each other for 4 generations. The genetic isolation had continued. The medical consequences were severe. Of the 37 children born to the Carter family over 4 generations, only 9 had survived to adulthood. Infant mortality from genetic disorders exceeded 75%. Those who survived often carried multiple disabilities, their bodies and minds broken by the accumulation of genetic errors. Next, Dr. Hayes traveled to Leslie County to find the Meadows family. They were the largest of the isolated clans with nearly 30 members spread across a small valley accessible only by a treacherous mountain path. The Meadows had maintained their isolation since 1854 when Patriarch William Meadows had brought his family to the area fleeing a murder charge. What distinguished the Meadows from the other families was their awareness of their situation. The current family head, a man named Thomas Meadows, greeted Dr. Hayes with a mixture of hope and despair. "We know we're destroying ourselves," Thomas said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've watched my brothers and sisters die young. I've buried 7 of my own children, but we don't know how to stop. This is all we've ever known." Thomas was 38 years old, but looked 60. He walked with a severe limp, the result of a congenital hip deformity. His wife, who was also his first cousin, had died the previous winter, giving birth to their 8th child, a daughter so severely deformed she had lived only 3 hours. The Meadows family represented a critical point in Dr. Hayes's understanding. Here was a family that recognized the destruction they were causing themselves, but felt powerless to escape it. The isolation that had begun as protection from the law had become a prison of genetics and psychology. At length, Dr. Hayes interviewed Thomas about the family's history. He told her stories passed down through generations, children born without the ability to speak, teenagers who never developed mentally beyond infancy, adults who died suddenly from heart defects or seizures. The family cemetery, a rough clearing marked with crude wooden crosses, contained more than 80 graves, most of them children. "The worst part," Thomas confided, "is knowing that every child born to us carries this curse. When my wife was pregnant, I prayed every night that the baby would be born normal. But I knew deep in my heart that God couldn't hear prayers from people like us. We'd sinned too much, gone too far down this road." By the summer of 1967, Dr. Margaret Hayes had documented all 5 families that Ezekiel Holloway had mentioned. The Brock family in Clay County numbered only 6 members, the last survivors of a line that had produced more than 50 children over 4 generations, but had seen most die in infancy or childhood. The Turner family in Breathitt County had been reduced to a single elderly couple and their 3 severely disabled adult children. The cumulative weight of what she had witnessed drove Dr. Hayes to action. She compiled her findings into a comprehensive report documenting the genealogies, the medical conditions, and the devastating human costs of sustained consanguinity in isolated populations. Her report included photographs, medical charts, and detailed case studies that painted an undeniable picture of genetic catastrophe. In August, she presented her findings to the Kentucky State Department of Health in Frankfort. The reaction was immediate and complex. On one hand, health officials were horrified by the conditions she described. On the other, they struggled with how to respond to families that had existed in isolation for more than a century. "Dr. Hayes," said Dr. Robert Mitchell, the state's chief medical officer, "what you're describing is unprecedented in modern America. But these are American citizens living on their own land. We can't forcibly remove them or mandate medical interventions without their consent. Then what can we do?" Dr. Hayes demanded. "Just let them continue to suffer. Let more children be born into this nightmare." The state's response was to authorize a comprehensive study and outreach program. Dr. Hayes would lead a team of physicians and social workers to engage with the families, provide medical care, and gently educate them about the genetic consequences of their isolation. The goal was not to force change, but to offer alternatives. When Dr. Hayes returned to the Holloway compound in September with a team of 3 other medical professionals, she found the family in crisis. 2 children had died over the summer, both from complications related to severe genetic disorders. Ezekiel Holloway had suffered a stroke and could no longer speak clearly. And Sarah Holloway, the woman who had first brought her granddaughter to the clinic, had taken her own life, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. The younger generation of Holloways, particularly a woman named Mary, who was Ezekiel's granddaughter, proved more receptive to Dr. Hayes's message than the elders had been. Mary was 26 years old, born with a twisted spine and limited use of her left arm, but her mind was sharp and her spirit unbroken. "I've lost 3 babies," Mary told Dr. Hayes, tears streaming down her face. 3 babies who couldn't breathe right, couldn't eat right, couldn't live. "I can't do this anymore. I can't bring another child into this world knowing what we are." To Mary, Dr. Hayes explained as gently as she could the science behind what was happening. She used simple terms, avoiding medical jargon, but ensuring that Mary understood the core truth. When families marry only within themselves generation after generation, harmful genetic mutations accumulate until the very survival of the line is threatened. "Is there any way to fix it?" Mary asked desperately. "Can you make it so the next children will be normal?" The painful truth Dr. Hayes had to deliver. "The damage that's already there can't be undone, Mary. But if your generation chooses to marry outside the family, to bring in new bloodlines, the children of those unions would have much better chances. It won't happen overnight, and there will still be challenges, but over time, yes, the family could heal." This conversation, repeated with variations across all 5 families over the following months, represented the beginning of change. But change came slowly and with tremendous resistance from the older generations. Now think about Mary's desperate question to Dr. Hayes: "Can you make it so the next children will be normal?" If you felt the crushing weight of that hope, if you understand the pain behind those words, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have said to Mary? In the Meadows family, Thomas took the radical step of sending his 2 youngest children, both relatively healthy boys, aged 8 and 10, to live with distant relatives in Lexington. It was the first time in over a century that any Meadows child had left the mountain. The decision tore the family apart, with older members accusing Thomas of betraying their heritage. "Heritage?" Thomas shouted during a family gathering that Dr. Hayes witnessed. "Our heritage is dead babies and broken bodies. Our heritage is watching children suffer and die. If breaking from that makes me a traitor, then I'm proud to be one." More tragic was the Carter family's response. Rebecca Carter, the family matriarch, refused to accept Dr. Hayes's explanations. She clung to the belief that their suffering was divine punishment for some unnamed sin, not the consequence of genetics. When her daughter attempted to leave the hollow with plans to move to a nearby town, Rebecca physically prevented her from going. The confrontation escalated, and in the chaos, Rebecca suffered a fatal heart attack. Her daughter, consumed by guilt, returned to the family compound and never spoke of leaving again. Dr. Hayes witnessed how generations of isolation had created psychological chains as strong as any genetic ones. But there were victories, small but significant. 3 young women from the Holloway family, including Mary, accepted Dr. Hayes's offer to help them find work and housing in Cumberland. It was a terrifying step into an unknown world, but they took it. Within a year, 2 of them had married men from outside their bloodline. The children born from those unions, while still carrying some genetic legacy from their mother's heritage, were notably healthier than their cousins who remained on the mountain. Dr. Hayes continued her work throughout 1968 and into 1969. She secured funding for a permanent medical clinic that would serve the isolated communities, staffed by physicians who understood the unique challenges these families faced. She arranged for special education programs for children with developmental disabilities. She even managed to get several of the most severely affected individuals accepted into medical facilities where they could receive proper care. But the resistance to change remained strong among the older generations. Ezekiel Holloway, partially recovered from his stroke, spent his final year arguing against everything Dr. Hayes represented. In a rare moment of clarity, he told her, "You're killing us just as surely as the old ways did. You're killing who we are." With that accusation, Dr. Hayes struggled. Was she destroying a unique, if tragic, community, or was she offering them salvation from a nightmare of their own making? The ethical questions haunted her. The scientific community took notice of Dr. Hayes's work. In 1969, she was invited to present her findings at a medical conference in Chicago, the first time the full scope of sustained consanguinity in Appalachian populations had been documented and shared publicly. Her presentation, titled Genetic Isolation and Its Consequences, a study of 5 families, became a landmark in the emerging field of genetic counseling. Other researchers followed her into the mountains, conducting more sophisticated studies with better tools than she had available. They confirmed her findings and expanded on them, documenting not just the physical consequences of consanguinity, but the psychological and social impacts as well. The 1970s brought significant changes to the isolated families of Harlan County and its surrounding areas. The completion of new roads made the once inaccessible hollows easier to reach. Television signals penetrated even the deepest valleys, bringing images of the outside world into homes that had existed in near-medieval isolation. And slowly, painfully, the walls that had separated these families from the rest of society began to crumble. But the genetic legacy of 5 generations could not be erased so easily. Dr. Hayes continued to monitor the families throughout the decade, and what she observed was both hopeful and heartbreaking. The children born to family members who had married outside their bloodlines were indeed healthier. But they still carried hidden genetic damage that manifested in unexpected ways. Mary Holloway, who had been among the first to leave the mountain, married a coal miner from Cumberland in 1968. Their first child, a daughter born in 1969, appeared completely healthy. Mary and her husband celebrated, believing they had escaped the family curse. But when their son was born in 1971, he exhibited the same facial deformities and cognitive impairments that had plagued the Holloway line for generations. The genetic damage had skipped a generation, hiding in the daughter, but emerging in the son. The realization that one generation of outcrossing couldn't undo a century of inbreeding devastated Mary. Dr. Hayes found her in the clinic one autumn day in 1972, sobbing uncontrollably as she held her 3-year-old son who would never speak, never walk, never live independently. "I thought I did everything right," Mary wept. "I left the mountain. I married a good man from outside. Why is God still punishing me?" No easy answers Dr. Hayes had. The science was clear. Recessive genetic disorders could lie dormant for generations before manifesting. Mary's children carried genes from both the Holloway line and their father's line, but the Holloway genetics were so damaged that they dominated. It would take multiple generations of outcrossing before the family's genetic heritage was diluted enough to significantly reduce the risk. This became a pattern Dr. Hayes observed across all the families. The children of the first outcrossing showed improvement, but not freedom from genetic disorders. Some were lucky, inheriting enough healthy genes from their non-family parent to appear normal. Others carried the full weight of their ancestry in twisted bodies and struggling minds. A particularly tragic example of this persistence of genetic damage was experienced by the Meadows family. Thomas Meadows's sons, who had been sent to Lexington, both married women from outside their bloodline when they reached adulthood in the late 1970s. Between them, they had 7 children. 4 appeared healthy and developed normally, but 3 inherited severe disabilities, one with a profound heart defect that required multiple operations, another with the same skeletal abnormalities that had plagued the Meadows line for generations, and a third with cognitive impairment so severe he required institutional care. The discovery that even geographic separation and marriage outside the family couldn't guarantee healthy children broke something in Thomas. He began drinking heavily and withdrew from his remaining family members still on the mountain. Dr. Hayes found him in 1975, living alone in his cabin, refusing visitors. He died in the winter of 1976, officially from pneumonia, but Dr. Hayes believed it was really from a broken heart and the crushing weight of guilt. Perhaps the darkest outcome of all was faced by the Carter family. After Rebecca's death, the remaining family members retreated deeper into isolation, rejecting all outside contact. When social workers finally gained access to their compound in 1974, they found conditions that shocked even seasoned professionals. Of the 7 family members still alive, 5 were severely malnourished and living in what could only be described as squalor. 2 children, products of the most recent generation of consanguineous unions, were so profoundly disabled they required constant care that the family could no longer provide. The state intervened, removing the children to medical facilities and offering assistance to the adults, but the damage was done. The Carter bloodline, which had produced over 60 individuals across 5 generations, was functionally extinct. The last Carter child died in a state hospital in 1978, his body simply unable to sustain life beyond his 14th year. All of this Dr. Hayes documented in her continuing research, which became increasingly well known in medical and academic circles. By 1976, her work had been published in 3 major medical journals and cited in a landmark Supreme Court case regarding genetic counseling and informed consent. Her documentation of the Appalachian families became a cautionary tale taught in medical schools across the country. But for Dr. Hayes, these weren't statistics or case studies. They were people she had known, children she had tried to help, families whose suffering she had witnessed firsthand. The professional recognition meant little compared to the faces that haunted her dreams. In 1977, she made her final visit to the Holloway compound. Only 6 family members remained living on the mountain, all elderly or severely disabled. The younger generations had all left, seeking lives beyond the shadow of their ancestry. The cabins were falling into ruin, nature reclaiming what humans had briefly carved from the wilderness. Ezekiel Holloway had died the previous winter at age 78. Before his death, he had asked Dr. Hayes to visit him one last time. She found him in his bed, his body failing, but his mind clear. "You were right, doctor," he told her, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything you said was true. We destroyed ourselves generation by generation and called it tradition. We sacrificed our children on the altar of pride and ignorance." "Mr. Holloway," Dr. Hayes began, but he raised a trembling hand to stop her. "Let me finish. I want you to tell our story. Tell everyone what happened here. Not to shame us, but to warn them. There are other families out there in other mountains, other isolated places, making the same mistakes we made. Tell them where it leads. Tell them about the children who never had a chance." He died 3 days later. Her promise Dr. Hayes kept. By 1980, the isolated families of Harlan County had effectively ceased to exist as distinct genetic entities. The Holloway, Carter, Meadows, Brock, and Turner families had either died out or integrated into the broader population through marriage and relocation, but their legacy remained written in medical records, genetic studies, and the lives of those who carried their damaged heritage. Dr. Margaret Hayes retired from active practice in 1982, but she never stopped working on behalf of the families she had tried to save. She established a foundation dedicated to genetic counseling in rural Appalachia, funded by a combination of private donations and government grants. The foundation provided free genetic screening, education about the dangers of consanguinity, and support for families dealing with inherited disorders. Her final major work, published in 1983, was a comprehensive book titled The Hidden Cost: Genetic Isolation in American Communities. It told the complete story of the 5 families using pseudonyms to protect privacy but maintaining meticulous accuracy in detailing the medical and human consequences of sustained inbreeding. The book became required reading in medical genetics programs and prompted renewed efforts to identify and assist other isolated communities facing similar challenges. Research teams fanned out across Appalachia and other remote regions, finding scattered families living in genetic isolation, though none as extreme as those Dr. Hayes had documented. Mary Holloway, who had been the first to break from her family's isolation, became an advocate for genetic education in rural communities. Despite the challenges she faced raising her disabled son, she traveled throughout Kentucky in the mid-1980s, speaking at schools and community centers about her family's history. Her testimony was powerful because it came from lived experience. "We didn't know," she would tell audiences, her voice breaking with emotion. "We didn't understand what we were doing to our children. We thought we were preserving our family, keeping our blood pure, maintaining our independence. Instead, we were poisoning ourselves generation after generation." By the late 1980s, genetic testing had advanced to the point where descendants of the isolated families could learn what specific mutations they carried. The results confirmed what Dr. Hayes had long suspected. The genetic damage was profound and would persist for multiple generations, even with consistent outcrossing. One particularly poignant case involved a young woman named Jennifer, born in 1975, to parents who had both descended from the Meadows family through different lines. Jennifer appeared completely healthy and developed normally through childhood. She married at age 22, and when she became pregnant in 1998, she and her husband opted for genetic screening given her family history. The results devastated them. Jennifer carried multiple recessive mutations associated with severe developmental disorders, heart defects, and shortened lifespan. Her husband carried none of these mutations, which meant their children had a 50% chance of being carriers, but would likely be physically healthy. However, if their children married someone with similar genetic heritage, the cycle could begin again. Jennifer's decision to proceed with the pregnancy, armed with knowledge her ancestors never had, represented a kind of hope. Her daughter, born healthy in 1999, was named Margaret after Dr. Hayes, who had passed away in 1997 at age 74. Far beyond the families she had directly helped extended the scientific legacy of Dr. Hayes's work. Her meticulous documentation provided researchers with invaluable data about the progression of genetic damage across multiple generations of sustained consanguinity. Studies based on her work contributed to our understanding of recessive genetic disorders, population genetics, and the importance of genetic diversity. But perhaps the most important legacy was the human one. The story of the Appalachian families became a powerful argument for genetic counseling, for education about the dangers of isolated populations, and for the importance of reaching even the most remote communities with modern medical knowledge. By the early 2000s, improved roads, communication technology, and social programs had effectively eliminated the kind of extreme isolation that had led to the tragedy of the Holloway, Carter, Meadows, Brock, and Turner families. But the lessons of their suffering remained vitally relevant. Today, descendants of these families live throughout the United States, most unaware of their ancestors' tragedy. The genetic mutations persist in the population, diluted but present, occasionally manifesting in unexpected ways. Medical professionals in Appalachia remain vigilant, aware that the shadow of consanguinity can stretch across generations. The abandoned compounds where these families once lived have been reclaimed by the forest. Nature has erased the physical evidence of their existence. But the story endures in medical schools, genetic counseling programs, and public health courses. Students still learn about the isolated families of Harlan County and the devastating consequences of genetic isolation. More than just research papers and case studies was left behind by Dr. Margaret Hayes. She left a warning written in the suffering of 5 families and the death of countless children. Genetic diversity is not just a biological advantage. It is a human necessity. The attempt to keep bloodlines pure leads inevitably to degradation, disability, and death. The last surviving member of the original 5 families, a woman named Ruth, who was Ezekiel Holloway's youngest daughter, died in a nursing home in 2005 at age 73. She had spent her final years telling her story to anyone who would listen, hoping that her family's suffering would not be forgotten or repeated. "We were born into sin," she told a reporter in her final interview, her words echoing the title that would later describe her family's tragedy. "Not because we were evil people, but because we inherited the consequences of choices made generations before we were born. Every child born to our families carried the weight of 100 years of mistakes. That was our sin and our punishment." That interview was used by the reporter who conducted it as the basis for a documentary film that aired on public television in 2007. The film brought the story of the isolated families to millions of viewers, ensuring that the lessons learned from their tragedy would reach new generations. In the end, the story of the Holloway, Carter, Meadows, Brock, and Turner families is not just about genetics or isolation or the dark history of rural Appalachia. It is about the consequences of choices, the persistence of harm across generations, and the terrible price paid by innocent children for the sins of their fathers. It is a story that must be remembered not to shame or sensationalize but to prevent history from repeating itself in other isolated communities, other closed populations, other families who might believe that isolation protects when it actually destroys. The children of the Appalachians who inherited their families' forbidden past are gone now, but their legacy remains. It is written in medical textbooks, genetic databases, and the memories of those who witnessed their suffering. And it stands as an eternal warning. Some traditions are worth breaking. Some bloodlines must be opened. And some secrets are too dangerous to keep. If you've watched until this point, you've witnessed one of the darkest chapters in American genetic history. This story matters because it could happen again. Subscribe to this channel to ensure you never miss stories that reveal the hidden truths about genetic isolation and its devastating consequences. If you made it to the end of this tragic story, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly appreciates these important historical accounts. If this story impacted you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to understand the real cost of genetic isolation. These stories must be told, remembered, and learned from. The mountains of Appalachia still stand, silent witnesses to a tragedy that should never be forgotten.